First, I want to begin by situating parking in the wider transport context and discuss why we're interested in it. If we look at the big picture of transport policy in London, the strategic aims are all about sustainably accommodating growth in the city. London is expected to add roughly 1 million people to its population over the next 10 years, and this demographic growth, combined with changes in how goods and people are moving around the city, means that there is increasing pressure on the road network. As a result, London is in the top 10 most congested cities in the world. The overarching policy aim is for mode shift. The mayor's targets are for 80% of journeys to be made by walking, cycling and public transport by 2041. And despite progress over the longer term, in recent years this has slowed. If you take the trends from the last 5 years and project them forward, we won't actually reach this 80% target by 2075. This is illustrated by the dark blue line on the chart. So a big change is needed. All of these kind of more immediate pressures are underpinned by a serious crisis in air quality and the looming threat of climate change. 23 London boroughs now have declared a climate emergency, and so there is a pressing need to start taking some more serious measures. Now, in terms of car ownership and usage, in total, 56% of London households have access to a car. However, while we might have seen some significant attitudinal changes in recent years with respect to the car, there has only been about a 3% reduction in car ownership over the last 15 years. Now, this is despite a fall in the number of trips driven per day in London at 23% over the last 5 years. So people are using their cars much less, but ownership levels are still holding up. And this is a good illustration of one of the barriers to fully car-free lifestyles. However, cars aren't the only demand on the curb space, and the space given over to park cars has an opportunity cost in terms of what else it could accommodate. So things like cycling infrastructure, green space, and priority bus lanes. How we prioritise these different demands and allocate space accordingly is a key consideration. And when you look at the total amount of space given over to cars, it is really significant. Now, we've used a number of different measures in the report to try and convey the scale of the space here. For example, the total space occupied by vehicles in London is 32 kilometres squared, which is equivalent to 22.5 Hyde Parks in size. 43% of that is on street, so you're talking around 10 Hyde Parks completely covered by cars. Using Appiway kerbside data, we've estimated that there is a total of over 1 million resident and short stay spaces in London. Now, the length of this road space, if you laid all of these back to back, is over 5,000 kilometres. This is equivalent to the distance between the US and the UK across the Atlantic. So how do we currently manage parking in London? In short, it differs depending largely on geographies. This chart shows the relative differences between parking controls across boroughs. The blue is the total proportion of the road network that is controlled parking zones, and the yellow is the uncontrolled. You can see on the chart that the trend shows a real split between inner and outer London. More suburban boroughs tend to have smaller coverage of CPZs, although there are a couple of outliers, with some outer London boroughs having more pro-public transport and active travel policies. In terms of how much we pay for parking, there is really wide variation between charging structure and levels, which are set locally. Here you can see the average costs of residence permits across inner and outer London, inner being more expensive. However, this average way of showing it obscures some of the diversity of arrangements. So there is variation by emissions levels, others vary it by engine size, by your neighbourhood or by the number of vehicles per household, and you've got things like diesel charges and exemptions for electric vehicles. But given the value of public land, are we pricing this particular use of it appropriately? A simple analysis of how much people are potentially underpaying can be made by looking at the cost of residence permits against how much roughly equivalent spaces are rented for in the open market. We took an average price from a number of spaces for each borough and worked out what a yearly cost on Just Park would be. You can see that the Just Park spaces were going for almost 10 times as much, which suggests that the market can support much higher prices. Another way to demonstrate the effective subsidy that drivers receive was to look at how much residents pay for parking and compare that against how much it costs to actually operate a parking space. We carried out our own calculations of how much a space costs to operate, and as you can see, our figures suggest that even the most expensive residential parking permits don't cover their own costs, And in fact, most people will not actually be paying those. However, beyond the different kinds of financial values discussed, it's important to know how Londoners view alternative uses of the kerb, given that the majority of households in many boroughs don't actually own a car. The problem with traditional consultations is that you can't be sure if they're actually representative. As such, we surveyed Londoners on a number of questions relating to car use, attitudes to parking, and alternative uses of the kerb. The chart above shows the relative priorities of Londoners. So on-street parking for residents comes only fifth, behind green, community and children's play space. So what more can we do? What are the kinds of policy tools that authorities can use to achieve the kind of desired objectives? The following recommendations we're going to suggest are a range of options that different boroughs can take depending on local circumstances. Recommendation 1. Here we're calling for boroughs to prioritise some of the different uses of the kerb. They could do this through developing kerbside strategies in order to consider the kerb and all of its competing uses holistically. Part of this should include reallocating a certain amount of kerb space towards higher priority uses, defined according to a kerbside hierarchy, which we've included in the report. This would be a much more strategic, joined-up way of managing the kerb than the slightly piecemeal and haphazard way that frequently happens. And here is a suggested kerbside hierarchy from the report. You can see it prioritises better access for public transport and pedestrians, disabled bays, green space, cycle parking, and loading. Recommendation 2 is about making sure there is a strategy and proactive approach behind extending CPZ coverage, rather than simply ad hoc reactions to requests. This includes the suggestion of capping the overall number of permits issued, as Brighton have done. If boroughs are gradually reducing the amount of parking space over time, they could reduce permit numbers through a process of resident churn and not automatically reissuing when new people move into a house. So once CPZs have been introduced, this is about looking at pricing as a demand management tool. At a minimum, we're calling for no free parking, blue badge holders accepted, and here this is trying to get the message across that parking isn't a right. Similarly, to reduce cross-subsidy, we're calling for residents' permits to cover their own costs. We'd also like to see consistency in the pricing structures for permits. So these could be emission-based or engine size-based escalating charges, and they should be organised across the same bands, through London councils perhaps, and prices could still be set at the local level. This recommendation is about non-residential parking and controlling demand at destinations. We're calling for boroughs to consider introducing a workplace parking levy, and that it should be explicitly linked to infrastructure improvements to support mode shift. There are a number of other initiatives led by the private sector that boroughs could support to help change commuting patterns. For example, lift sharing, dedicated car sharing parking spaces, or even discounts on bus travel. Now, clearly reducing dependency on private cars means providing alternatives. This recommendation is about how we can facilitate some of those shared mobility alternatives across London. The Car Club and Doctors Bike Hire point is about allowing for greater take-up, so operators have left London citing inconsistencies across boroughs in the city. Mobility credits could be used as incentives to give up parking permits. There are examples of this happening in new developments already. For instance, people receive Car Club membership in lieu of parking spaces. And we want to see these kind of schemes expanded. And finally, this recommendation is about how we can embrace the opportunities that new technology offers for kerbside management. We recognise that for the more advanced suggestions here, there are some significant upfront capital costs to consider. But things like mapping the kerbside digitally could provide big efficiency gains. And there is also a need to recognise that the advantage of this isn't just about efficiency. Automatic charging, for example, has the quite revolutionary potential to change the whole adversarial culture around parking between drivers and local authorities, which is something which should benefit us all.